Hello and welcome to Aspects of History. I'm Oliver Webb Carter and I'm the editor. If you're new to Aspects of History, we're a magazine and website dedicated to history and historical fiction. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com where you'll find articles, interviews, book reviews and short stories, and they're all absolutely free. Our magazine is at the insanely cheap price of under a tenner for a year's subscription, and that's under a tenner in American as well. Anyway, on to the podcast. If you enjoy it, please give it a great rating. It'll help us carry on running them. Today I'm speaking to the Tudor historian Sarah Gristwood. Sarah has written a number of acclaimed books, including Game of Queens, The Women Who Made 16th Century Europe, Arbella, England's Lost Queen, and Blood Sisters, The Women Behind the Wars of the Roses. Sarah has written a new book, Tudors in Love, which deals with courtly love, the courtship tradition that began in the 12th century but which was most prominent in the Tudor period. Sarah and I talk about those practitioners of courtly love, Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, and Queen Elizabeth I. I do hope you enjoy our chat. Hello, Sarah Gristwood. Welcome to the Aspects of History podcast.
Thank you.
It's number 2 for us. Thank you for joining us. And we're here to talk about your new book, which is out next week, I think. Tudors in Love, the courtly code behind the last medieval dynasty. Great. So I have some questions for you, Sarah, and then we can talk all about this fascinating subject.
Sure.
So your new book, it deals with the courtly code during the medieval period, and then obviously goes into the Tudors in great detail. But what was courtly love, and was it different to chivalry, or was it the same?
Well, do you know, of course, everyone says to me, oh, courtly love, oh, how interesting. What was it? And you'd think by now I'd have come up with a snappy one-liner, but it's no good. That frankly defeats me, because it's a bit like smoke, it's everywhere and nowhere. There's been a lot of academic discussion as to whether courtly love really existed in the world beyond books and manuscripts. I believe it did, but it began with the songs of the troubadours. And it was sort of crystallized in the late 12th century in a whole burst of literary activity. So far, so obscure. But the thing is, courtly love didn't die. It never, ever lay down and gave up the ghost, to the degree that I'd argue not only did it deeply colour the comportment of the Tudors, huge revival in the 19th century, and I'd say still affects all our ideas of romance today. But at its core, courtly love was literally, what the words say. The words are, only came into common use much later. But the idea was a fine, fin amour was one phrase, amour courtois, that this was a refined spiritual form of loving, which may or may not be platonic and unphysical, which was completely independent of marriage. And of course, marriage, for an aristocratic lady of the 12th century or many centuries after, was not a matter of love, pure or otherwise. It was something arranged by her family and for their advantage. If she was lucky, she might come to love or at least like her husband, but that wasn't the deal. So at that time, late 12th century, the court of Marie de Champagne, Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughter, two books were probably written, which really encapsulate courtly love. One was that by Chrétien de Troyes, who actually the poet, the writer, said that it was his patroness, Marie, instructed him to write down for the first time the tale of Lancelot and Guinevere. King Arthur of legend, his dearest friend and his wife having it off, basically. An adulterous very famous love affair, which nonetheless saw both partners honoured for the strength of their feeling. I mean, in the real world, obviously, church and state absolutely condemned adultery and could exact the harshest penalties on a woman, real savagery. But in this kind of, wonderful fantasy world, Arthur and Guinevere were true lovers, and that wiped away all sins. The other book that was written, probably there, was by one Andreas Capellanus, Andrew the Chaplain, who set down in a whole book on loving actual rules for courtly love. How basically there's nothing that the lover, the knight shouldn't do for his lady, that true love always includes a measure of jealousy. I mean, I do like that one of his rules was try to avoid lying completely, but hey, that's the dark side of courtly love, you might say. And it's possible that Andreas Capellanus had his tongue slightly in his cheek, because he described actual courts of love where Mary, Eleanor and the rest, adjudicated on knotty points of etiquette. And do we really think that happened? No, we don't. That's, it's probably that fantasy that's brought the whole idea of courtly love into disrepute. But nonetheless, there was something there, a kind of emotional reality, powerful enough that the idea never went away, adapted through the centuries, but never vanished completely. You can see why, in a way, because if you were an aristocratic lady, perhaps with your own dreams and ambitions, which the real world gave no place to fulfill, you can see why this idea could be very appealing.
So you mentioned the aristocratic ladies. Yes, and obviously they were often married because of their family requirements, this sort of dynastic requirements. And it doesn't seem that many were marrying for love, obviously. But is that a bit of a misconception in some cases? Because I was reading in your book, Elizabeth Woodville seemed to have, love in that relationship. At least to me, my rather sort of, innocent.
Well, was there? I guess it depends. Sorry, I'm sounding like Prince Charles. I guess it depends what you mean by love. Certainly, the meeting of Elizabeth Woodville and Edward IV, the new young, Yorkist king, was told as a piece of absolute bang-on courtly fantasy. They're meant to have met on May Day, hugely important in the courtly love calendar. It was said that Elizabeth held him off, saying that if she was not good enough to be his wife, then she was too good to be his mistress, which is real, again, courtly love stuff, nobility by worth, not birth. Whether that meeting actually happened in quite that way is a whole different story. But whether Elizabeth at that time, I don't know there's any indication that she fell in love with Edward then. She may well have sought the marriage with the king, why wouldn't she? And indeed, it came to be an extremely happy and successful marriage, despite Edward's infidelities. That's the way things were meant to work. And for Elizabeth and Edward, it did. But the courtly element of it, again, slightly shows that kind of blurred line between fantasy and reality.
You've mentioned him before, Andreas Capellanus, who's got these recommendations or rules on courtly love, which are quite amusing to certainly modern eyes. But he does seem to encourage the abuse of women who are of lower rank, which is less funny. And obviously most women in the medieval period were not aristocrats, so probably not involved in courtly love. So how stark was the contrast between the two groups?
Well, it's a good question. You see, I'd say that even for the aristocratic woman, there was a great deal of appeal in this dream, this fantasy. But there's a question of, whether it actually affected their lives in daily reality. But also, I'd say there are some big traps for women in the courtly love fantasy. I mean, the dream, the ideal, put the lady on a pedestal. Trouble is, there's not much you can do on a pedestal except fall off it. And it kind of had the woman as this, admired, adored, but passive object. I mean, there is an old story about two World War II flyers, one English, one American. And one, I think it was the American, said, in the States, we put our women on a pedestal. And the Englishman said, yeah, good idea. You can see their legs better that way. And I feel there's a strong element of that about the courtly fantasy, that while it seemed to offer women, ladies, a kind of power, potency they didn't have in daily life, or didn't often have, there were some real traps there, as well, I'm sure we'll get onto this, but as Catherine of Aragon, for one, would find out. But as you said, yes, one of the dangerous things about courtly love, to me, is that it sets up the idea that there are people, women, who matter and those who don't. And I think we see that cast out, played out in all too many stories of abuse. Yes, indeed. In the midst of all these, not highfalutin dilemmas about love and romance and spiritual love, he discusses what should happen if the knight, the lover, falls in love with someone not of his own order, not a lady. And if it's a woman from actually the peasant class, he says, a measure of force may be necessary as a convenient cure for their shyness. So you do really think. You asked earlier, what about courtly love and chivalry? And in a sense, courtly love is, the feminine wing of chivalry. But you do hear something like that, a measure of force may be necessary, and think so much for chivalry.
So moving on to the Tudors, and obviously, this is where it gets very juicy. Henry VIII would court.
That's why we love them.
Yeah, exactly. Henry VIII would court 6 wives, and probably more women than that. Is he the archetypal example of the male attempt at courtly love in the Tudor period?
Yeah, well, you see, it's an interesting word in that context, court, because I'm not totally sure that Henry did court his later wives. I think it's absolutely right with the earlier ones, with Catherine of Aragon in a different sense, as well as, of course, the ultimate example, Anne Boleyn. But yes, I think you're right. I think Henry was besotted with the courtly fantasy, and all I can do now in this time is just say it glibly, but in the book I obviously trace this out a bit more. One can see from his reading as a child, a boy, from the people, the tutors hired for him and so on, that he had access to all the old, not only the Arthurian, but the courtly stories. And he was someone who was in love with the idea of love. He was a fantasist, basically. You can see that early in his reign, and before, how he loved dressing up, Robin Hood, whoever, all those games where no one was supposed to recognize him. In his early years, of course, he'd no sooner come to the throne than he suddenly swooped down to marry his older brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, which the idea had been on the cards for years, but no one really was sure he was going to see it through. But Henry clearly loved Catherine, but also I think loved the idea of the rescue. Catherine had had pretty fair hell for several years, for a number of years in England, under the reign of Henry VII. She was sort of half the dead prince's widow. She had no money and no place, basically. And one of Henry's first acts as king was to swoop in and rescue her by marriage. And she was. We tend to think of her now as this slightly dumpy, doughty, frumpy, older figure. But at the time, she was 5-6 years older than Henry, sure, but that only made her, in her mid-20s, quite beautiful, glamorous, and a kind of, more experienced in the world than Henry, who was actually a very inexperienced 18 when he came to the throne. Catherine, for the young Henry, had all the attributes of the courtly lady. Unfortunately, one of the traps about courtly love, for the woman in the case particularly, is that it doesn't really deal with the idea, the long years of marriage, things getting less sexy and romantic, people aging, and of course in their case all the, Catherine's endless unhappy childbed experiences. And really, that is one of the problems with courtly love. You could say that the whole idea of courtly love wound up colouring our idea of romance and, all the novels from kind of the 19th century onwards. And an awful lot of them, think Jane Eyre even, end with, "Reader, I married him." And that's it. End at the church doors. And again, courtly love, didn't really give much space for actual ordinary daily life. And maybe that's why Anne Boleyn, this figure, this idea of Anne Boleyn appeared and so enraptured Henry, because certainly you can see it in their courtship. And as you said, sorry, that was a very long answer, but as you said in your question, Henry's courtship of Anne Boleyn certainly shows him absolutely delightedly flexing his muscles as the courtly suitor. Although he's the king, he writes to Anne about being her servant, about how his heart and he are, they're ready for her. He's really positioning himself as the archetypal courtly lover. And of course, we don't have the letters, tragically, the letters Anne wrote back to Henry, but we can only assume that that was a role she, with her continental education, was very well placed to play.
Anne Boleyn, now she obviously, his pursuit of her, as you say, it's very interesting. But in Angeus Capellanus, and I keep on coming back to his rules because I find him quite
right.
Yeah, he's fantastic. Yeah. But Capellanus's rules, I think one of them it states, and I'm sure I've not got the quote right, so you can correct me. But it's an easy conquest makes love cheaply regarded. A difficult one causes it to be held dear. So,
quite.
Well, I was gonna say Anne seemed to follow that one quite rigidly, didn't she?
Yes. I mean, absolutely. I mean, indeed, who knows? There may have been an element of Henry himself holding off once he realised he wanted to marry Anne, and that any child they had to be clearly legitimate. But yes, absolutely. That whole idea of the period, perhaps as long as 7 years, when they didn't, they were not lovers in the full sense. And oddly enough, in Thomas Malory's Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur, which of course was printed in the very year, the months of the Battle of Bosworth, when the Tudors came to the throne, Mallory lamented that these days, he said, men couldn't go a sennight 7 days, a week, without getting there, basically, getting their rocks off. But that in the old days, true lovers could wait 7 years if necessary. Odd coincidence that 7 years may be just about as long as Henry and Anne did. But it really does seem likely that, yes, that rule you quote may well be the key to Anne's huge appeal for Henry. I mean, certainly even Cardinal Wolsey, who, as we know, was no friend to Anne in the first place, nor she to him, heaven knows. When he was trying to sell Henry's marriage, to rulers abroad and so on, he said that he was pitching it that Anne's appeal for Henry was her virtue. There's this long list of adjectives about, her, all of which are the absolute classic stuff of the courtly lady. And one of them is, her determined virtue, her chastity, basically.
Well, we move to Anne's downfall, which, well, I guess those allegations of sexual misconduct were thrown at her, but I imagine that the real reason is probably the lack of a male heir, or certainly, a significant reason. Was the courtly code applied in dealing with Anne, as we move to this stage of their relationship?
Yes, I think it was. As you say, I mean, the real reasons why Anne had to fall is something we all debate today. And the honest answer is probably it was a bit of a perfect storm. There was Henry's undoubted urgent desire for a male heir. There was political faction at court. There was even England's rapport with France and Spain, played a part. And there was Anne's falling out with Thomas Cromwell over the dissolution of the monasteries. But what I'd say was fairly certain is that whether or not the real reason for Anne's fall, and I mean, one reason, not obviously the whole reason, was her comportment, her behaviour as queen, that she continued to behave more like the courtly mistress than the wife. Even if that were completely untrue, it's still notable that it was the kind of relation, those adulterous relationships, those flirtations described in the literature of courtly love that were brought as accusations against her. So I'd say that those old rules of courtly love were certainly used against Anne. They provided a weapon in the hands of those, whether it was more the king or Cromwell, who wanted to destroy her. Even as Anne was arrested, was taken to the Tower, you can still see some of those old tropes at play, quite precisely. I mean, Anne on her way to the Tower said that, she thought perhaps the king was only doing this to test her. Well, fat chance. I mean, it was pretty unlikely, but that was a very, very repeated gambit of courtly love scenarios. In the Tower, Anne speculated that perhaps she might be allowed to retire to a nunnery, a convent, but she also recalled predictions that a Queen of England would be burnt. Well, it's an odd coincidence. Hard to believe Anne didn't think of Arthur's Queen Guinevere, sentenced either to the flames or to a nunnery.
Well, yes, that's what I wanted to get onto, actually, because she wasn't burnt, she was beheaded, but Anne's execution and the nature of it, Henry's use of this finest French swordsman as delivering the blow, is often mentioned as an example of his sort of chivalric or courtly love, the character that would that showed that he did sort of care, but to modern audiences that seems quite a strange way to express one's love. Are we going wrong in somewhere there?
I think again, it's a complex pattern. I think that Henry's mind, like that of his daughter Elizabeth, was a particularly complex matter. And I think several things may have been going on here. I mean, yes, in a sense, it was a kindness in that the sword was likely to give a swifter and presumably less agonizing death than the axe. But the fact that the sword was also a powerful symbol of chivalry and thus of, the sort of courtly code, think Excalibur, may have had, several layers of meaning here. Because on the one hand, yes, it could be a kind of strangely chivalric gesture. On the other hand, this was the code through which and against which Anne was held to have offended.
So that's the end of part 1. In part 2, out next week, we discuss more of the Tudors, including Henry VIII's other wives, that tragic figure Lady Jane Grey, and perhaps England's greatest monarch, Queen Elizabeth I. So do join us then. Thank you and good night.